None of this was known at the time, incidentally, so like I knew nothing about it when I was a teenager growing up, but in fact only in recent years it's been revealed that, incidentally, it wasn't a big secret. Like if you read Adam Smith, he bitterly condemns British policies in India. He argued that, according to his version of economic theory, everyone should gain by the free interaction of the imperial powers and the colonies. But he says, because of what he called the savage injustice of the Europeans, meaning primarily the British, this didn't happen, and they were ruined and destroyed. He was particularly bitter about Britain's imposition of famine in India. This is back in mid-18th century. He said British policies in India, his phrase was, I think, converted dearth to famine by forcing the farmers to produce, say, opium for export. This is the early days. It was much worse later, rather than food for the people, and the result was, severe destruction and hunger and so on. So even then, there was information about it, but the scale and character of it has only really been learned over the years from more recent scholarship. Indian, and a lot of this comes out of Indian scholarship, but now it's penetrating into Western scholarship. So if you go back to your question, what did I know in the 1930s and 40s? Well, I knew that imperialism was pretty rotten and harmed people, but the extent and character of it was very much concealed. And of course, this wasn't the general picture. The general picture is that, the imperial Europe is bringing enlightenment and civilization to the backward natives. Actually, it's pretty striking to see how leading enlightened figures treated this. Like, take, say, John Stuart Mill. It's quite remarkable if you read him. He has a classic essay. It's taught in law schools to this day on intervention. It's one of the classic essays on intervention, and it's treated as if it's critical of intervention, so it's regarded as one of the early critical classics. However, if you read it, it's quite different. This is John Stuart Mill I'm talking about, not somebody, some guy way off on the right-wing flag waving. He says, well, we have to be really careful about intervention, and the reason is that Britain is kind of an angelic society. It's not like the rest of the world. It's unique in its magnificence and high values and so on. And in fact, we're so magnificent that people try to, the Europeans, thinking mainly of people, the continental Europe, to try to attribute to us evil motives, because they can't believe that anybody could be this magnificent. So when we consider intervention, we have to recognize that even though we're always doing it for the most uplifting, benign motives, we're going to be subjected to obloquy and condemnation while Europeans try to attribute to us all sorts of evil intentions. And then he turns to India. This was in 1859, I guess, right after what they call the Indian Mutiny, that is the uprising, which was put down with extreme brutality. And it was known in England. There were parliamentary inquiries. It was no secret that there was horrible brutality in putting it down. And that's the context in which Mill was writing. And he says, well, we have to consider intervention in India. Of course, we're doing it for the benefit of the natives, but and maybe they don't understand it, but in the case of barbarians, you just can't pay attention to what they think because they don't understand. So we have to intervene for their benefit and to uplift them and civilize them and so on, even though we're going to be condemned by the Europeans for our bad motives, and the barbarians won't understand why we're doing this for them. That's John Stuart Mill, kind of the peak of British Enlightenment, and let alone the others, you know. So, in fact, what England was doing, as he had to know, he was an official of the East India Company, I think it was secretary or something, so he knew what was going on. This is after the first Opium War, and right at the beginning of the second Opium War, which was utterly vicious. I mean, what Britain was doing was they wanted to conquer most of India so they could try to gain a monopoly of opium. And they needed opium to break into the Chinese market. The Chinese didn't want British goods. They said their own goods are better. We don't want to import stuff from Lancaster. And the only way you could break that down, this is the period of a lot of talk about free trade, you know, how wonderful it is. The only way you could open the Chinese market was to send gunboats in and smash Chinese resistance and force on them something that the leadership wanted to keep out, opium. So if we can dope up the population with Indian opium, then we can we'll force our goods on them and we'll get what we want from them. That's the enlightened period of British imperialism, and India suffered from it because it was being conquered to try to gain monopoly of opium. They didn't quite make it. There were American merchants in there who managed to get a piece of the opium trade and so on. But it's not a very pretty story all around. But again, none of this was known really until fairly recent scholarship.
So, like around the same time, or maybe a little later in your career, like through the 50s, you were also revolutionizing the field of linguistics by giving it a cognitive orientation. And you've mentioned in the past that the models that you proposed for the study of natural language syntax have close parallels with those proposed by the Indian grammarians for Sanskrit, like particularly the notion of production rule and the generative aspect of the grammar is somewhat similar to what Panini had done for Sanskrit.
It's interesting. I didn't know anything about this.
So what?
Which is kind of striking, because one of the people I was studying with was an excellent scholar whose background was in Indic scholarship, and he knew all of this. And I was an undergraduate kind of making it up, you know. But he never pointed out to me that there's a tradition. And I think the reason is because the tradition was considered exotic and insignificant. We don't study that kind of stuff. We're modern. We're inventing everything from scratch. You just look at structural linguistics, and nothing ever happened before we started working on it. You know, that was the general attitude. And in fact, if you look at the history of linguistics, it's pretty grotesque. It's improved in the last 20 or 30 years, but at that time it was pretty awful. I've reviewed some of it later. So I only learned about it later. And it was even worse than that. It turns out that Leonard Bloomfield, who was the leading figure in American linguistics, was a complete schizophrenic. He was very much influenced by the Vienna Circle, logical positivism, and you know, everything has to be done the way the logical positivists do. And you read his book Language, it ridicules the idea of ordered rules or anything like that. So that was one part of his brain. The other part of his brain, he was a scholar and also knew the Germanic and also the Indic tradition. And when some of his actual work, in particular a study of an American Indian language called Menominee, when he worked on Menominee, it was on a Paninian pattern. But he didn't publish it in the United States. He published it in Czechoslovakia. That was not many years before. That was 1939. I was a student in 1946, not that big a gap. A 16-year-old kid coming into the field knowing nothing, starting to work. And I was starting to kind of reconstruct something like, not that dissimilar from what Bloomfield had just done. Nobody pointed it out to me. everyone knew Bloomfield, not only because he was the leading figure, but they knew him personally. And he had a respected figure, but not a single person pointed out to me that what I was trying to reinvent was pretty similar to what Leonard Bloomfield had done a few years earlier and had roots way back to classical India. Again, all of this stuff was learned later. There were a lot of interesting reasons for that. Partly it was things that were happening in the United States at the time. If you look at that whole period, post-war period, it was a period of tremendous self-congratulation in the United States and a contempt for Europe and for history. And there are interesting reasons. It hasn't really been studied because, you know, history is written by intellectuals. They don't like to write about themselves. But if you look back at what happened, it's quite interesting. Before the Second World War, the United States was an intellectual backwater. If you wanted to be a physicist, you went to Germany. You want to be a philosopher, you go to England. You want to be a creative writer, you go to Paris. You know, the United States is kind of, you know, some rural backwater where nothing happens. So Europe was the exciting place. The Second World War changed all of that. Europe was devastated. The United States gained enormously from the war. At the end of the war, the United States was in a position of just overwhelming power, had literally half the world's wealth and incredible security. The wartime government programs, research and development programs, had created a lot of it, very advanced technology by the standards of the day. And of course the U.S., Britain had a little of it, but Britain was smashed by the war. Germany had quite a lot. In fact, they were more advanced than the West, but that was all essentially either destroyed or stolen. A lot of German scientists, including Hitler's scientists, were brought here. Some were taken to Europe, to Russia. You know, they're both raiding it, but they had very advanced technology. But that all became U.S. technology. All of a sudden, we're not a backwater anymore. We're the center of the world, and that shows up in policy. I mean, you know, there were elaborate plans made to essentially rule the world. They were implemented, but it also showed up just culturally. We're so far ahead. Partly it's that the U.S. was indeed much more advanced economically and technologically, but partly it was psychological. We don't have to go to them to study anymore. They have to come here because we're the ones who understand everything and do everything. I mean, European scholars, well-known European scholars, were kept out of American universities, partly out of fear. You know, they were just too good. We didn't want the competition, but partly out of just contempt for everything European or in the past. That's the environment in which I went to school. This period of self-glorification and euphoria. And it runs right through the 1950s. You see it all over the place. When I was a student at Harvard in the early 50s, and everything, this is the psychology, philosophy, you know, what became the brain and cognitive sciences later, was just emerging. It was all strictly American. Didn't read anything else. There were a couple of us. One was my colleague in the next room, my oldest friend, another Eric Lenneberg, three graduate students who just didn't believe everything. And by ourselves, we started just reading European biology. Ethology it was then called, basically comparative biology. Tinberg and Lorentz, people like that, which was considered just anathema. Nobody talked about it. And we learned quite a lot. You know, they did interesting, important work that's fed into our own efforts, mine and others, to a sharp critique of the whole behavioral science approach to all these topics. But it broke sharply with the kind of self-congratulatory period of the American science and technology during those years. And it was partly based on reality, like in the sciences. by the 1930s, chemistry and physics had been pretty much unified. Chemistry wasn't reduced to physics, contrary to what it says. On the contrary, physics changed radically and was able to become unified with chemistry. Then you go through the 40s and the early 50s, and it looked as if biology could be unified with chemistry. So Crick and Watson, Pauling and others. And it looked as if, well, now we've mastered, we've taken care of chemistry and physics. I mean, some things to fix up, but we basically understand them. Biology is now incorporated into this unified science. Quite an exaggeration, incidentally, but that's the mood. And now we have to go on to the next frontier. Next frontier is the mind, intelligence, and cognition. So you get the beginnings of, what in reaction to this actually became cognitive science. At that point it was behavioral science. You study behavior, you do it the American way and so on. But that was basically the atmosphere. It was so extreme that even well-known American scientists were ignored. Like a famous neurologist who was in fact at Harvard, Carl Lashley, around 1950, published some studies of complex behavior in their organization, which were a very sharp refutation of the whole behavioral science approach and of radical behaviorism and everything else, which was just a dogma at Harvard. I was a student there at the time. I never heard of it. I learned about it later from an art historian, and then wrote about it. When I wrote about it in 1957, I think that was the first time it had ever been mentioned. And here it was right at Harvard. And but the insularity and self-confidence and arrogance of the whole intellectual atmosphere was astonishing. And I think its roots were partly just what I described. Now we're on top. Before we had to go to them to learn things, but now we run everything. So we'll do it our way. Forget about the past. And going back to your point, that I suspect is one of the main reasons why I was never even told about the traditional origins from people who knew it, good scholars, knew it but kind of repressed it because it was considered kind of insignificant or just some minor quirk that they happen to study. This stuff can't be of any interest. By now it's improved. There are people who, one person who you may know is Fritz Stahl, who, a very smart guy. He was a logician. He studied linguistics. He studied here for a while. We were friends. He died recently. But he kind of began to bring out the Indian scientific tradition. And the work that he did is pretty revealing. I mean, I didn't know anything about it before, but he found that there were Indian scientists in the medieval period and up to the 14th century who were doing work which was kind of parallel to and comparable to some of the early modern science. I think that mostly ended after the British conquest. The same in China. China and India were the industrial, commercial, and intellectual centers of the world in the 16th, 17th century. Europe was a backwater, kind of like the United States in the 30s. And so that was where, for everything from industry to culture, but it was pretty much crushed by the imperial conquest. In China, it led to what they call their century of humiliation. They're just pulling out of it now. And India was largely marginalized, complex, like Calcutta remained one of the intellectual centers of, in a way, the world, but the West didn't know about it. A lot of book publishing, rich intellectual life, but the British didn't take it seriously. The standard view was essentially Macaulay's. We have to civilize them. or mills. You know, they're barbarians. What could they know? Yeah.
Linguistics, there is some discussion about the Indian tradition, but there are other fields like mathematics or metallurgy where, I mean, the contributions of the Indian tradition have been immense, but they are, even today, they are completely unheard of. Like, many people find it surprising when they are told that the decimal system originated from the work of Indian
or for that matter, the Arab contribution.
Right.
By now, it's kind of known among specialists, and of course, there's one dramatic exception to that. That's Ramanujan,
Right.
who was brought to England by kind of an Indian clerk. You know, had amazing discoveries in number theory, and he was discovered by G.H. Hardy, who was one of the leading British mathematicians. He was brought to Cambridge. A very interesting history, actually, what happened then. But he became known. But he was considered just like some miracle worker, you know, kind of off the planet, which he was in some ways. Yeah.
So I believe you've been to India a couple of times in the past. So have you like, do you think that Indian society is fundamentally different from societies of industrialized and developed nations in the West? Like, we have one thing that always comes up for discussion is that we've always had this decentralized systems, both politically and economically, and as a consequence, a lot of the diversity still survives. But at the same time, the flip side of this kind of system that we've had is that it makes very difficult for people to organize and for people's movements to come about. So do you
Well, that was true in the West too. Remember that imposition of the contemporary nation-state system in Europe was the result of centuries of murderous, savage conflict. I mean, the 30 Years' War, for example, 17th century, it must have killed maybe 40% of the population of Germany. And these were, even right up till today, languages are disappearing very rapidly in Europe. So say in Italy, which is, you know, one of the later developing societies, there's plenty of people in Italy who can't talk to their grandmothers because they talk a different language. It's all being unified, and the state system imposes a kind of a frame of unity and a coordination that didn't exist in the societies at all. In fact, you can see this as the European Union introduces its centralizing tendencies. There's a counter tendency of regionalization. So areas like Catalonia, the Basque Country, Wales, and others are reasserting their individuality, recovering their languages, their cultures, and want to separate, becoming more autonomous. So there's a mixed picture. And in the United States, a different story. The United States just exterminated the population, so of course it's uniform. You go from, you know, Boston to Los Angeles, you don't even know you're left. But the settler colonial societies, like the offshoots of England, like the United States, Australia, New Zealand, to a large extent Canada, it's different from imperialism. They said, the British imperialism in India didn't wipe out the population. Plenty of atrocities, but they didn't try to replace the population. They ruled over them. In the settler colonial societies, population had to be, as the founding fathers actually put it, exterminated, which is pretty much what happened. And this is incidentally forgotten. So, for example, to this day, literally, you can read in the most elevated left liberal intellectual journals that there wasn't any population here. There was an article in the New York Review. New York Review, it's the leading kind of left liberal intellectual journal in the English-speaking world. About 2 years ago, they had an article in which somebody was reviewing books by some historian and a well-known writer, I won't mention his name, but in which he said that he learned such amazing things. He learned that when Columbus reached the Western Hemisphere, there were only about 1 million people in the hemisphere, kind of hunter-gatherers straggling around. Actually, he's off by about 80 million or maybe 100 million, and they had advanced civilizations and big cities, and that's today. Actually, I looked to see if there's going to be any letters commenting on it. Not a single letter was published, but the editors must have gotten some criticism, because about 4 months later they published a small correction, which wasn't much of a correction. In fact, it was almost as bad as the original. But this is the leading kind of left liberal intellectual journal in the English-speaking world. Actually, it has a kind of a sister journal in England, London Review, which is even more to the left. About the same time, they had an article which was not that bad, but not that great either. It just referred to, in passing, it referred to the Native American population as being, treated harshly or something, like exterminated. But it's just not part of Western consciousness. That just is what happened in India, isn't in British consciousness. Or what happened in Ireland, for that matter. There was 800 years of really vicious oppression. I mean, the Irish remember it. I remember once traveling through Ireland. I went from Dublin to Belfast with some civil rights activists in Belfast. We were taken my wife and I, to a farm in the southern part of Northern Ireland, Armagh, South Armagh, and met a farmer. We were introduced to him because his son had just been murdered by the British, so it was a big issue. He took us around his farm, and practically every stone he described to me what Cromwell's army had done there in the 1640s. They don't forget, but that's the victims. The victors don't remember. And I think you find that all over the world. You want to learn about Native American history here, you read the studies done by Native Americans. I mean, by now, some others, but that's where the memories are. And I'm sure you find that just everywhere. And my first visit to India was in 1972. I was invited by the government, actually. It was Nehru Memorial Lectures, and it was pretty weird, I have to say. Interesting, very interesting, but pretty strange. For one thing, I had an enormous amount of protection. I mean, I couldn't walk out of the hotel without some guy. It wasn't in uniform, but he must have been some high-level police officer taking me into a car. And I know he was an important. Every time we passed a traffic signal, he'd make some gesture to the policeman there, and they'd let the car go through. So, but I remember one striking experience. Actually, I went with Indira Gandhi, who I spent some time with. I went with her to an Asian fair that was going on. I had more protection than she had, and one of the squares in downtown New Delhi, I forget which one it was, there were about 40,000 squatters there. And I drove by one morning and there was nobody there. And I asked what happened, and they said, well, they were trucked into the country, dumped out in the country somewhere, because they had to make the place look prettier for the Asian fair that was going along. And nobody seemed to have a kind of a second thought about it. Well, that's what we do. And incidentally, I asked at one point why I was getting so much protection. And I was told that they looked up my biography and found that I'm Jewish, and they thought I might be a target for PLO terrorists. I tried to explain to them I'm more likely to be a target for the Mossad, but that didn't get anywhere. Incidentally, this happened again just a couple of years ago when my wife and I spent 3 weeks in India, and I was traveling around in Kerala. I gave a lot of talks. One of them, in the question period, something came up about Kashmir, and I said something about Indian atrocities in Kashmir, something that everybody ought to know. It's right in the major report. The next day, there was a BJP demonstration outside of another talk And people who were with me were very worried about that, and the rest of the time I was in India, I had police protection the whole time, which is totally ridiculous in my opinion, but that's what they thought, you know. But I mean, the striking thing about India, it's a fascinating country, but the thing that you just can't miss is the absolutely hideous poverty. I mean, you can't walk down the streets of, you know, New Delhi without seeing it, let alone poor places, you know. But people don't see it, you know. It was pretty striking to me. Actually, I once drove through Delhi or New Delhi there with a very impressive woman. She was a woman, I won't mention her name, who had been a professor at JNU, sociologist, and she quit to go live in Rajasthan in a very poor village where she was working on women's issues, you know, for 17 years, I think, living in a hut and so on. It's a really dedicated person. We happened to be driving together in New Delhi. We were going to a demonstration where we were each going to speak. And I noticed that she never looked out the window. And you know what it's like. I don't know, you stop at a street corner and miserable people. And I asked her, you know, how do you live with this stuff? And she said, the only way to live with it is not to look. You know, if you look, you're so devastated you can't survive. But I think people somehow internalized it. The shining India crowd, I don't think they even see what's going on. And it's right in front of you, you know. Let alone, you know, the Bombay slums, which are just incredible. But I went from India to Pakistan, my wife and I, and you know, Pakistan's not an ideal society by any means, but I didn't notice a difference. Like in Calcutta, when we went to the markets and so on, you know, you're just being dragged into stores by people who are trying to force something on you, and miserable poverty everywhere. When we went to the same places in Lahore, it was just like going through a market. You know? That's the poverty and misery, and it shows up in the statistics. Actually, there's some interesting studies which are never discussed. Amartya Sen, who you know, great specialist in famine, and Jean Drèze, an economist at JNU, they did some comparative studies of India and China from liberation up till 1979, when the Chinese reforms started, so their studies stopped, but basically the Maoist period. And that includes the huge Chinese famine, which they discussed. You know, they just compared the two countries during that period. And they say, yeah, the Chinese famine they describe it as a political famine, and not because anyone wanted it to happen, but for their Sen's usual reasons. In the totalitarian system in China, information just never reached the center. They didn't know what was happening. By the time they found out, it was much too late to do anything. And they point out that in relatively democratic India, that hasn't happened. So after the British were kicked out, there weren't any more famines. They were always able to adapt. As they put it, India put as many skeletons in its closet every 8 years as China did during its years of shame, you know, the famine years. And 100 million people over this 30-year period. That's quite a... And this is democratic capitalism, so that just can't be reported. I mean, literally in the same articles, can't be seen. It's actually, when Sen got a Nobel Prize, I got a lot of interviews about it, and I kept bringing this up, and the only reporter who was willing to report it was an Indian reporter. I don't remember his name, but he picked it up and reported it. And I think that's, you know, that's shining India. It hasn't changed a lot. I mean, the numbers are maybe different, but structurally it's, and by now there's a lot of wealthy people, but you know, but there's many more who are just living in misery. I mean, I'm sure you know the facts better than I do, but even food intake has declined since the reforms. Average caloric intake his work on this by, what's his name, Utsa Patnaik, economist at JNU and others. So it's and nothing's being done about it. I mean, they're just being totally marginalized. On the other hand, it's a remarkable country in many ways if you can not look out the window.
So, what hope do you see for people's movements for people to organize themselves and come up and try to find solutions for these problems? In a society such as India, what hope do you see for people to organize?
Well, there's a lot of vibrancy and excitement in the society. I think there's plenty of things that can be done. And there are people who work hard on these things. Take somebody like Arundhati Roy, for example, who's a very wonderful woman, very courageous. I mean, she went out into the forests where the tribal people are basically being annihilated, and the area opened up for destruction for commercial interests, and people didn't like what she wrote. She was, in fact, death threats and condemnation and so on, but she keeps going. And there are some critics, good critics, who say that she kind of tended to glorify the Maoist element. Okay, maybe, I don't know. She was mostly writing about the people. And I think that's, and there's a lot that can be done. And there are plenty of, like this woman who I mentioned who lived in Rajasthan, there are plenty of dedicated people who are really working on these things. Might as well tell you her name. Her name's Aruna Roy. Who you probably know. Yeah.
So before we finish, one last question. Are you familiar with the Hindu concept of avatar? With the Hindu concept of avatar as this expression of cosmic intelligence in human form, which happens from time to time in order to restore balance between the elements?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard of it, but not familiar.
Have you considered that definition applies very well to you?
No. I'm a very ordinary person, nothing special, really.
Okay. Thank you.